In the sleepy village of Netherfold, roses used to bloom like miracles. 3 years in a row, Lavinia Gray's garden won the silver cup, until suddenly nothing grew. Stems blackened at the root. Leaves turned sickly yellow. Prize bushes withered overnight. No slugs, no blight, no accident. Someone was poisoning her garden, not to steal a prize, but to keep a secret love from ever leaving. A quiet gentleman with poetry on his lips and poison in his pocket watched her dream of moving away and decided her roses must die first. One midnight visitor, one missing button, one bottle of arsenic buried like a confession, and one elderly lady with knitting needles and eyes that see everything, who quietly unraveled the most heartbreaking crime of all. This is the story of Miss Marple and the garden that wouldn't grow, who poisoned the roses, and why love can be the deadliest weed of all. Chapter 1. The Withered Roses. The village of Netherfold lay tucked between low wooded hills in that part of Radfordshire, where the fields still ran to hedgerows thick with hawthorn, and the lanes were narrow enough to make motor cars an occasional intruder rather than a daily nuisance. It was a place where the post came punctually at 8:30. The church bells rang changes every Sunday morning, and the most exciting event of the year was usually the horticultural show in the village hall. At Dame Mead Cottage, the smallest but neatest of the dwellings that bordered the green, Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed chair by the sitting-room window. She was knitting a pair of gray woolen bedsocks for old Mrs. Bantry, who felt the cold even in June, and at the same time keeping an unobtrusive watch on the street outside. Very little escaped those mild blue eyes behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. The morning was fine, with sunlight slanting across the garden and touching the delphiniums with that particular clear blue that only comes in early summer. Miss Marple had just reached the heel of the second sock when the garden gate clicked and a brisk step sounded on the path. Mrs. Arthur Prestwich appeared at the open French window, hat ribbons fluttering, cheeks flushed, and an air of suppressed excitement about her that was quite foreign to her usual calm. "Miss Marple, Jane, may I come in?" "I simply had to see you at once." Miss Marple laid the knitting carefully on the little rosewood table beside her. "Of course, Elspeth. Do sit down. You look quite upset. Is it one of the children again?" Mrs. Prestwich sank into the chintz-covered armchair opposite, fanning herself with a folded handkerchief, though the day was not warm. No, nothing like that. It's Lavinia Gray. Poor Lavinia, she's in the most dreadful state. I've just come from the Larches, and really, Jane, I've never seen anything so pitiful." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. "Miss Gray? But she was perfectly well at the Mothers' Union last week. What has happened?" "It's her garden," said Mrs. Prestwich, lowering her voice as though the roses themselves might overhear. "Her beautiful garden, the one everyone in Netherfold envies. You know how she's won the silver cup for best rose display 3 years running? Well, this year nothing will grow, nothing at all. The beds are full of blackened stems and wilted leaves. Even the things that came up so splendidly in May have simply collapsed. She's tried everything: new compost, seaweed manure, even that special tonic from the nursery in Market Drayton. Nothing makes the slightest difference." Miss Marple paused in her knitting. "Everything dies at the roots?" "Yes, or turns a horrible yellowish color and flops over. Lavinia says it's as though the life has been sucked out of the soil. She's quite convinced it's some sort of curse. You know how fanciful she can be when she's upset." Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "A curse would be very dramatic," she observed mildly, "and rather inconvenient to arrange. I wonder, have the vegetables been affected as well as the flowers?" "Everything. The asparagus bed is a ruin. The sweet peas have blackened at the base, and even the lavender border she planted it herself 5 years ago is dying patch by patch." She cried, Jane, actually cried. "I've never seen Lavinia cry before." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Lavinia Gray was not a woman given to easy tears. Tall, upright, with a profile that might have belonged on a cameo, She had always conducted her life with a certain brisk competence. That she should be reduced to tears over her garden spoke volumes. "I think," said Miss Marple, "that I should like to see it for myself." Mrs. Prestwich brightened at once. "Would you?" "Oh, I was hoping you might. She keeps saying no one can help, but if anyone can see what's wrong, it's you. You've always had such an eye for these things." Miss Marple smiled a little. "I have an eye for people, Elspeth. Gardens are only interesting because people make them." She rose, folded the half-finished bed socks neatly, and fetched her second-best hat, the one with the little bunch of velvet pansies, from the hall stand. A light coat, her sensible shoes, and a small string bag completed her preparations. They walked the short distance to the larches together. The house stood a little apart from the rest of the village, approached by a gravel drive lined with lime trees. Its Georgian front was pleasing without being grand, its windows long and gracious. But today, the beauty of the place seemed overshadowed. Even the climbing rose on the porch looked discouraged. Miss Lavinia Gray met them at the door. She was wearing an old gardening skirt and a faded linen blouse, and her eyes were suspiciously bright. "You've heard, then?" she said without preamble. "Everyone has heard, I suppose." "Only the worst of it," Miss Marple answered gently. "May we see?" Miss Gray led them round to the south side of the house, where the main garden lay. What had once been a picture of ordered loveliness was now a scene of quiet devastation. The long herbaceous border showed patches of brown and black. The rose beds were full of twisted, leafless canes. The rock garden, usually bright with saxifrage and aubrietia, was a patchwork of shriveled clumps. Miss Marple walked slowly along the nearest path, bending now and then to examine a plant more closely. She touched a blackened delphinium stem, rubbed a leaf between her fingers, sniffed the faint unpleasant odor that clung to it. "Not slugs," she murmured, "nor ordinary blight. Something has got into the roots. Something persistent." Miss Gray gave a short, unhappy laugh. "I've had the soil tested. The analyst says the pH is all wrong, far too acid, but I've never lined so carefully in my life. Last autumn I put down tons of it, or so it seemed." Miss Marple straightened. "And the roses? They were your special pride, the worst of all. Anna Harkness, my best chance for the silver cup this year, has scarcely a leaf left. I found her this morning looking as though someone had poured scalding water over her." Miss Marple's gaze traveled thoughtfully across the garden to the low wall that separated it from the lane beyond. A small gate stood there, seldom used, leading to a footpath that wound eventually past the old mill house. "Has anyone else been in the garden recently?" she asked. "Only myself and old Gurney, my gardener. And he's been as puzzled as I am. He swears he's done nothing different." Miss Marple nodded. "People do notice things, even when they don't realize they've noticed them. I should like to come again tomorrow, if I may, when the light is different. Sometimes one sees more in the evening." Miss Gray looked at her with a mixture of hope and bewilderment. "You think there's something to see?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that when a garden is well cared for, as this one suddenly refuses to grow, it is not usually the garden that is at fault. It is usually a person." She smiled her gentle, deceptively vague smile. "And persons," she added softly, "are so very much more interesting than blights, and blights than poisons, don't you agree?" The two younger women stared at her. Miss Marple turned back towards the house, already mentally listing the little things she had observed. The faint yellowish stain on the handle of a trowel left lying on the path, the single broken twig on the far side of the rose bed, where no one had any business to be walking, and most curious of all, the absence of any bird song in a garden that had always been full of it. She said nothing more just then, but as she walked home beside Mrs. Prestwich, her mind was already turning over possibilities, quiet, ordinary possibilities that so often lie behind the most extraordinary happenings. In Netherfold, as in every village, the roots of trouble were seldom far below the surface, and Miss Marple had always been very good at tracing roots. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. By the afternoon following Miss Marple's visit to the Larches, the news of the stricken garden had traveled the length and breadth of Netherfold with the speed that only village gossip can achieve. It began, as such things usually do, at the post office, where Mrs. Sims presided behind her counter like a queen on a small throne, sorting letters and dispensing information in equal measure. Mrs. Sims had a round, comfortable face and an even more comfortable way of extracting confidences. When Mrs. Prestwich called for stamps that morning, she had been unable to resist a small sigh and the remark that poor Miss Grey was quite prostrated. Within half an hour, the information had reached the butcher's boy, who carried it to the kitchen door of Ivy Cottage. From there it passed to Mrs. Daphne Lorimer herself while she was arranging her dahlias for the evening. And by tea-time it had reached the tap-room of the Green Man, where Major Hargreaves was taking his customary pint of bitter. The Major, a stout man with a military mustache, now more white than khaki, set down his tankard with decision. "Jealousy," he pronounced. "Plain, unadulterated jealousy. Mark my words. Someone can't bear to see Lavinia Gray carry off the silver cup again. 3 years running enough to make anyone's blood boil. I shouldn't wonder if it's one of those modern chemical sprays gone wrong. People will use anything these days." Old Mr. Gurney, Miss Gray's gardener, who happened to be nursing a half-pint in the corner, shook his head mournfully. "'Tain't no spray, Major. I knows every inch o' that garden. Soil's been tampered with, that's what. Something put in deliberate like. Seen it before, in my young days, when a man wanted to spite his neighbor over a boundary hedge." The Major snorted. "Nonsense, Gurney. Who'd go to all that trouble?" But the seed was sown. By evening, the theory of deliberate malice had taken firm root. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned to Danemead Cottage and resumed her knitting in the cool of the sitting-room. She had placed a small table beside her chair, with a saucer of pot-pourri and a thigh copy of the Radfordshire Gazette open at the gardening notes. Every so often she glanced at the page, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was considering, not the roses themselves, but the people who tended them or failed to tend them. At 4:30, young Dr. Fenwick called. He was a pleasant young man, newly qualified, with an earnest manner and a habit of explaining things in medical terms. "I've just been to see Miss Grey," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "She's in a state of nervous exhaustion, poor lady. I've given her a mild sedative. But about the garden, she asked me if it could be some sort of poisoning. I told her it was possible copper sulfate, for instance, or even arsenic in small quantities over time. But who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Someone who wished the garden not to succeed, perhaps, or someone who wished Miss Grey to remain. "Occupied." Dr. Fenwick looked puzzled. "You mean to keep her at home?" "Or to keep her dependent," Miss Marple said gently. "People sometimes do strange things when they fear losing something or someone." The doctor frowned. "I hadn't thought of it in those terms. But surely it's more likely to be some horticultural accident. A misapplied dressing, perhaps. Or contaminated manure." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed. "But accidents usually leave traces that can be explained." This seemed so very thorough. After the doctor had gone, Miss Marple put on her second-best hat once more and walked down to the post office. She required no stamps, but she did require information. Mrs. Sims greeted her with the eagerness of one who has news to impart. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful about Miss Gray's garden? Everyone's talking of nothing else. Mrs. Lorimer was in here not half an hour ago, saying she quite understood how it must feel to lose one's prize blooms, though between you and me, she didn't look very sympathetic." Miss Marple purchased a pennyworth of peppermint drops and inquired innocently, "Has anyone suggested a cause?" "Oh, dozens of causes. Major Hargreaves says jealousy, and young Mrs. Trent thinks it's the new sewer they laid last winter, interfering with the water table. But the oddest thing," Mrs. Sims lowered her voice, "is that Mr. Carver hasn't been near the Larches for weeks." and he used to be there nearly every day when the roses were at their best. Mr. Carver? Miss Marple repeated, as though the name were only vaguely familiar. The gentleman at the old mill house. The one writing a book on rare flowers. Such a quiet, polite gentleman. He and Miss Gray were quite thick at one time. Teas on the lawn, long talks about hybridizing. Then nothing. Not a visit since April, so Mrs. Gurney tells me. Miss Marple nodded slowly. People do change their habits, she murmured. Sometimes quite suddenly. She left the post office with her peppermint drops and a small piece of new knowledge tucked away in her mind. That evening she took tea with Mrs. Prestwich at the Hollies, a larger house on the far side of the green. Mrs. Prestwich had invited her specially to talk things over quietly. The drawing room was comfortable, with chintz curtains and a fire of apple logs. Mrs. Prestwich poured tea from a silver pot and came straight to the point. Jane, what do you make of it, really? Miss Marple accepted a slice of seed cake. I think, she said, that we must consider motives as well as means. Someone has gone to a great deal of trouble. That argues a strong motive. Mrs. Prestwich shivered slightly. You don't think it could be, well, something personal? Against Lavinia herself? It is always personal when a garden is attacked, Miss Marple replied. A house can be burgled for gain. A reputation can be blackened for malice. But a garden, that is an extension of oneself. To destroy it is to wound the owner very deeply. Mrs. Prestwich looked at her friend with something like awe. You always see so much more than the rest of us. I see what is there, Miss Marple said simply. And what is not there? For instance, Mr. Carver has not called lately. Mrs. Prestwich's eyebrows rose. Edwin Carver? But he's such a harmless creature. A little dreamy, perhaps, always quoting Keats or Shelley when one least expects it. Lavinia used to find it charming. Then suddenly she seemed to cool. I asked her once if anything was wrong, and she said, Nothing at all, Elspeth. Only one discovers that some people are not quite what they seem. Miss Marple took a small bite of seed cake. Did she say anything more? Not really. But I thought at the time she looked disappointed, as though she had expected something, and it had not come. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She was knitting again another pair of bed socks, this time in lavender wool. Disappointment, she murmured, can be a very powerful emotion. More powerful sometimes than anger. Mrs. Prestwich leaned forward. Do you suspect Mr. Carver? I suspect no one yet, Miss Marple answered. But I observe, and I remember. There was once a case, not in Netherfold, where a gentleman poisoned a rival's rose beds because the lady he admired had promised to marry the man who grew the finest specimen at the county show. It was all quite romantic in its way. The rival won the prize, the lady married him, and the poisoner spent the rest of his life regretting his roses more than his lost love. Mrs. Prestwich gave a little gasp. Surely not. Oh, yes, Miss Marple said tranquilly. Human nature is very consistent. One has only to watch it long enough. She rose presently, thanking her hostess for tea, and walked home through the lengthening shadows. The village was quiet now. Lights shone behind curtained windows, and the scent of wood smoke hung on the air. As she passed the old mill house, she noticed that a lamp burned in an upper window. A shadow moved across the blind-tall, stooping a little, as though reading or writing. Miss Marple paused for a moment. Then she continued on her way, her step light and unhurried. In Netherfold, as in every place where people live close together, whispers carried farther than shouts. And tonight the whispers were growing louder. Miss Marple smiled to herself in the darkness. She had always found whispers so very useful. Chapter 3. A poisoned root the following morning broke gray and still, with a light mist hanging over the meadows beyond Netherfold, and the air carrying that damp, earthy smell that promises rain later in the day. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after a simple breakfast of tea and thin bread and butter, she put on her stout walking shoes and set out once more for the Larches. She had scarcely reached the lime tree avenue when she saw Miss Gray herself hurrying down the drive to meet her. Lavinia's face was pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and outrage. "Miss Marple, thank heaven you've come. I was just going to send the boy for you. There's been a discovery, something quite dreadful." Miss Marple quickened her step without appearing to do so. "Another plant has failed?" "Worse, much worse." "Come and see." They turned together along the south path. The garden looked, if possible, more forlorn than on the previous day. The mist clung to the blackened stems and made the whole scene appear ghostly. Miss Gray led the way to the principal rose bed, the one that held her treasured Anna Harkness and the other hybrid teas upon which so many hopes had rested. She pointed with a trembling finger. There, under the second bush from the left. Gurney found it when he was trying to fork round the roots to see if the soil was sour. Half buried in the loose earth lay a small glass bottle, no larger than a medicine phial. The label, though faded and muddied, was still legible in old-fashioned copperplate lettering. Arsenical weed killer, poison. The cork had been replaced rather clumsily, and a few grains of white powder still adhered to the glass near the neck. Miss Gray's voice shook. "I have never purchased arsenic in my life. Never. I use only the mildest preparations: nicotine for greenfly, soft soap for black spot. This thing was never in my possession." Miss Marple knelt carefully, heedless of the damp on her skirt, and lifted the bottle by its cork between finger and thumb. She turned it slowly in the pale light. "The label is old 20 years at least, I should say, but the cork is new. It has not swollen or discolored as an old one would. And see here." She indicated a faint ring of darker soil around the neck. "It has been opened quite recently. Within days, perhaps." Miss Gray pressed a hand to her mouth. "Then someone put it there, deliberately, to make it appear that I poisoned my own garden. Or," Miss Marple said quietly, "to make it appear that someone wished you harm. The intention is not always straightforward." She rose, still holding the bottle, and looked about her with that mild, inquiring gaze that so often disarmed people into saying more than they intended. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Only Gurney. I told him to say nothing to a soul until you had seen it. He's waiting by the potting shed now, looking as though he expects to be arrested." Miss Marple nodded. "Very wise. We will keep the bottle for the present, wrapped in clean paper, if you have any. And perhaps you would telephone Inspector Craddock at the county station. He is a sensible man. He will know what to do without making a commotion." Miss Gray hesitated. "You think the police should be involved? When arsenic is found buried in a garden that is dying, yes, I think the police should most certainly be involved. Even if only to satisfy the insurance company later on if there should be any question of malicious damage." The words were spoken so mildly that their implication took a moment to sink in. Miss Gray's eyes widened. "You mean this might be attempted something worse than mere spite?" "I mean," Miss Marple answered, "that we do not yet know what it is. But we shall be very foolish if we pretend it is nothing." Gurney was summoned. He was a wiry old man of 60-odd, with hands permanently stained brown from years of honest toil. He confirmed that he had found the bottle while loosening the soil round the rose roots. He had not touched it beyond brushing away the earth to see what it was. "Did you notice anything else unusual in that bed?" Miss Marple asked. Gurney scratched his head under his ancient cap. "Well, now you come to mention it, Mum, there was a sort of yellowish stain on the fork prongs afterwards. Thought it was just mud at first, but it didn't wash off easy. And the earth under that bush, it smelled queer. Not like good garden mold. More like burnt matches almost." Miss Marple thanked him and asked that he should continue his work as usual, saying nothing to anyone outside the household. By noon, Inspector Craddock had arrived, driven over from headquarters in his modest black saloon. He was a tall, spare man in his late 30s, with a quiet manner and a pair of very keen gray eyes. He had crossed Miss Marple's path before, in other villages and other mysteries, and greeted her now with a mixture of respect and faint amusement. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be at the center of this." "I am merely a neighbor, Inspector," she replied with her usual deprecating smile. "But Miss Gray was good enough to show me what has been found." Craddock examined the bottle, now carefully wrapped and labeled by Miss Marple herself, with the date, time, and circumstances of discovery. "Arsenic," he said. "Old stock by the look of the label, but as you pointed out, the cork is fresh. Someone has been handling it lately." He looked at the devastated rose bed. Could this account for the damage? "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "Arsenic is cumulative in the soil. Small doses over time would produce exactly this effect: gradual wilting, blackening at the base, yellowing of leaves. But the bottle itself holds very little. If it were the only source, the poisoning would be recent and localized. Yet the trouble is general throughout the garden." Craddock rubbed his chin. "Then either there have been several applications, or this bottle is a red herring." "Very possibly both," Miss Marple agreed. He glanced towards the house. "Any idea who might have had access?" "Anyone in the village, I'm afraid. The garden is not overlooked from the road, but the side gate opens onto the footpath that runs past the mill house and on to the common. It is seldom locked." Craddock made a note. "I shall have to speak to Miss Gray, of course, and to the gardener, but discreetly. No need to alarm the whole village yet." Miss Marple walked with him as far as the gate. As they passed the low wall, her eye was caught by something small and bright, half hidden among the ivy leaves. A tiny scrap of white cloth, no bigger than a postage stamp, caught on a thorn. She bent and retrieved it delicately. "A handkerchief corner, perhaps?" Craddock suggested. "Or a piece torn from something larger," Miss Marple murmured. "Cotton, quite good quality. And see, the stitch is machine done, but the initial in the corner is hand embroidered. An E or possibly an F." She tucked it away in her string bag without further comment. Craddock watched her with the expression of a man who has learned not to underestimate small details. "You think the saboteur left a calling card?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people who do things in gardens usually wear old clothes. And old clothes sometimes tear. It is a small thing, Inspector, but small things have a way of adding up. They parted at the gate." Craddock returned to the house to interview Miss Gray. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward along the footpath. She paused once, opposite the old mill house. Its windows were shuttered against the afternoon light, but a thin thread of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was at home. Miss Marple continued on her way, turning over in her mind the curious fact that the bottle had been buried so shallowly, almost as though meant to be found. A mistake? Or a deliberate misdirection? In either case, she reflected, it argued a certain haste. And haste, in her long experience, was very often the undoing of careful plans. She reached Danemead Cottage just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside, she removed her hat, put the kettle on, and sat down to her knitting once more. But the needles moved more slowly than usual. Somewhere in Netherfold, she thought, someone was watching, and perhaps wondering whether the little bottle had been discovered yet, and wondering, too, what would happen next. Chapter 4. The Jealous Rival. The rain that had threatened all morning arrived in earnest by midday, settling into a steady, soft downpour that turned the lanes of Netherfold to glistening mud and made the leaves of the lime trees drip in slow, regular rhythm. Miss Marple, however, was not deterred. She waited until the worst of the shower had passed, then put on her oldest mackintosh, tied a plastic rain hat firmly under her chin, and set off once more, this time in the direction of Ivy Cottage. Ivy Cottage stood at the opposite end of the village green from the Larches, a low, picturesque building half covered in Virginia creeper that turned scarlet in autumn. Its garden, though smaller, was a triumph of careful planning. Neat borders of dahlias in every shade, from primrose to deepest burgundy, rows of tall antirrhinums, and a fine display of early chrysanthemums under glass. Mrs. Daphne Lorimer, took her horticulture seriously, and it showed. Miss Marple knocked at the green-painted door and was admitted by a parlour-maid who looked faintly surprised to see a visitor in such weather. Mrs. Lorimer appeared almost at once, wiping her hands on a floral apron. She was a plump woman of about 45, with bright hazel eyes, a ready smile, and an energetic manner that suggested she was seldom still for long. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! Do come in out of this dreadful rain. You'll catch your death." She led the way into a cozy sitting room, where a small fire burned and a tray of tea things already stood waiting, as though she had expected company. "I've just made a fresh pot," she said, pouring without asking. "One needs something hot on a day like this. Now, sit down and tell me what brings you out in the wet." Miss Marple removed her rain hat, smoothed her hair, and accepted the cup gratefully. "I've been to see poor Miss Gray again," she began in her usual gentle way. "Her garden is in a sad state, as I expect you've heard." Mrs. Lorimer's expression became one of careful sympathy. "Yes, indeed, quite shocking. I was saying only this morning to my husband that one can't help feeling sorry for her. Though, of course," she added, with a small shrug, "one does wonder if she hasn't overdone the manures again. Lavinia will persist with those strong chemical feeds. Sometimes less is more, don't you think?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Perhaps. But this seems rather more than overfeeding. Something quite definite has gone wrong with the soil." Mrs. Lorimer set down her cup with a faint clink. "Well, I'm no expert on soils, but I do know one shouldn't let jealousy spoil one's judgment. Lavinia has had a wonderful run 3 silver cups in succession. It's bound to make people talk." "Talk?" Miss Marple echoed mildly. "Oh, you know how villages are. Someone always says there must be foul play when a favorite begins to fail. But really, accidents happen. Slugs, wireworm, honey fungus, any number of things." Miss Marple nodded as though in agreement. "Very true. Though in this case, the analyst's report mentioned an unusually high level of acidity, almost as though something had been added deliberately." Mrs. Lorimer gave a short laugh. "Surely not. Who would do such a thing? It's not as though the silver cup is worth a fortune. Just a bit of silver plate and local glory." "Local glory," Miss Marple repeated softly, "can mean a great deal to some people." There was a small silence. Mrs. Lorimer rose to poke the fire, though it needed no attention. "Well, I hope they find the cause soon," she said briskly, "for Lavinia's sake. Now, would you like to see my new border? The dahlias are quite splendid this year, even in this weather." Miss Marple expressed herself delighted. They went through the French windows onto a covered veranda, then down a short flight of steps into the garden proper. The rain had eased to a drizzle. Water dripped from the eaves and pattered on the broad leaves of the dahlias. Mrs. Lorimer walked ahead, pointing out her treasures with evident pride. "This is Bishop of Llandaff, such a marvelous red. And over here, Arabian Nights. The color is almost unbelievable. I shall enter at least 6 vases this year." Miss Marple admired politely, then allowed her gaze to wander. Near the veranda steps, on a small wooden table used for potting, lay a pair of gardening gloves, thick leather ones, well worn. On the cuff of the right-hand glove was a faint yellowish smear, almost the color of weak mustard. Miss Marple bent as though to examine a low-growing viola. "These gloves," she said innocently. "They look as though they've seen a good deal of use." Mrs. Lorimer glanced back. "Oh, those?" "Yes, I wear them for everything pruning roses, handling fertilizer. One has to be careful with one's hands at my age." "Quite so. And that yellowish mark, would that be from your own fertilizer?" Mrs. Lorimer hesitated for the fraction of a second. "Very likely. I use a sulfur-based dressing sometimes." "It does leave a stain." Miss Marple straightened. "Sulfur can be very useful," she observed. "Though in excess, it does rather acidify the soil, doesn't it?" Mrs. Lorimer's smile remained fixed. "I'm sure I don't overdo it. One learns by experience." They returned to the house. Miss Marple thanked her hostess for the tea and the tour, then took her leave, promising to call again when the weather was kinder. As she walked back across the green, the rain beginning once more, she turned over in her mind what she had seen. The yellowish powder on the glove matched very nearly the discoloration she had noticed on the dying leaves at the larches. Sulfur compounds could indeed sour soil over time, though they were seldom used in such quantities as to cause widespread devastation. Still, it was a possibility. More interesting, however, was Mrs. Lorimer's manner. The quick defensiveness, the little laugh that came too readily, the way her eyes had avoided Miss Marple's when the subject of deliberate interference was touched upon. Jealousy, Miss Marple reflected, was a very common motive, and Mrs. Lorimer had every reason to covet the silver cup this year. Her dahlias were indeed magnificent, yet something about the whole affair felt not quite right. Too obvious, perhaps, or too carefully staged. She reached Danemead Cottage just as the church clock struck 5. Inside, she hung her wet mackintosh in the scullery, changed her shoes, and sat down by the fire with her knitting. Presently, the telephone rang. It was Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple?" "I've just finished speaking to Miss Gray again. No new developments, I'm afraid, but I've sent the bottle and a soil sample to the laboratory. Results in a day or two." "Thank you, Inspector. And the handkerchief fragment?" "Being examined. Looks like ordinary cotton, but there may be traces. By the way, have you been making calls this afternoon?" Miss Marple smiled to herself. "I paid a little visit to Mrs. Lorimer. She was most hospitable." There was a short pause. And I noticed a mark on her gardening glove that might repay investigation. A yellowish stain. Possibly sulfur." Craddock gave a low whistle. "You don't miss much, do you?" "I'll have a word with her myself discreetly, of course." "Very discreetly," Miss Marple agreed. "People who feel themselves suspected sometimes do the most unexpected things." She replaced the receiver and returned to her knitting. Outside, the rain drummed steadily on the roof. Inside, the fire crackled comfortably. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from comfortable. She was remembering a small detail she had not mentioned to the inspector. On the same potting table, half hidden beneath a stack of seed packets, had lain a single brass button. It was small, ordinary, except that it bore the faint outline of a crest. The same sort of crest, she rather thought, that decorated the cuffs of certain tweed jackets worn by gentlemen who liked to quote poetry. She clicked her needles rhythmically. 2 suspects now, or perhaps 3. And still the garden at the Larches withered. Miss Marple sighed softly. Human nature, she thought, was really very trying sometimes. Chapter 5. The midnight visitor. The rain continued through the evening and into the night, a persistent patter against the windows of Danemead Cottage that lulled most of Netherfold into early sleep. Miss Marple, however, was not most of Netherfold. She had always found wet nights peculiarly useful for thinking. The sound of rain on the roof seemed to sharpen the mind without distracting it. She sat by her bedroom window in her dressing gown, the curtains drawn back just enough to give a view of the lane and the dark shapes of the gardens beyond. A small reading lamp cast a soft pool of light on her lap, where the lavender bedsocks were growing steadily. Every so often she paused, needles suspended, and looked out. It was a little after 11:30 when she saw it. A figure tall, cloaked in something dark that caught no reflection from the scattered street lamps, emerged from the shadow of the limes near the churchyard gate. It moved with purpose, keeping close to the hedgerow, avoiding the patches of moonlight that broke through the thinning clouds. The figure paused once, glanced about, then continued along the footpath that skirted the green and led directly to the side gate of the Larches. Miss Marple watched without surprise. She had half expected something of the kind. The figure reached the gate, hesitated only a moment, then slipped through. A minute later the garden itself swallowed it up. No further movement was visible from Danemead. Miss Marple remained at the window for another quarter of an hour. No one emerged. The house at the Larches stayed dark. No lights appeared in the windows. No door opened. Whoever had gone in had either left by another way or was still there. She sighed softly, closed the curtains, and went to bed. But sleep did not come at once. She lay thinking of cloaked figures and midnight errands, and of how very few people in Netherfold owned cloaks in this practical age. The next morning dawned damp but clear, with a fresh wind that set the puddles rippling. Miss Marple was up betimes, breakfasted on tea and a boiled egg, and walked straight to the Larches before the village was properly astir. Miss Grey met her at the door, still in her dressing gown, face drawn and eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "You've heard nothing?" she asked at once. "I saw something," Miss Marple answered gently. "Last night, about 11:30, a person in a dark cloak entered your garden by the side gate. I waited, but no one came out again, at least not by the same path." Miss Grey gave a small, sharp intake of breath. "Then it wasn't imagination. I thought I was sure. I heard footsteps on the gravel just after midnight. I got up and looked out, but saw nothing. This morning I found the worst yet." She led Miss Marple round to the principal rose bed. There, in the center, the prize bush and a Harkness, the one upon which all her hopes for the silver cup had rested, lay uprooted and trampled. The canes were broken, the buds crushed into the mud. The roots, torn from the earth, lay exposed like pale, wounded fingers. It had been done with savage thoroughness. Miss Marple bent to examine the damage. The earth was churned and soft from the night's rain. Footprints were blurred, but unmistakable, large, heavy, the tread of a man's boot. Near the ruined bush, half buried in the mud, something small and bright caught the light. She picked it up carefully, a single brass button, about the size of a sixpence, engraved with a tiny crest. A stylized mill wheel surmounted by 3 wheat sheaves. Miss Marple turned it over in her palm. "Do you recognize this?" Miss Grey shook her head. "I've never seen it before, but the crest, it looks like the old mill device. The one on the signboard at the mill house." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. She wrapped the button in her clean handkerchief and placed it in her string bag. "Inspector Craddock should see this," she said. "And the footprints, before the sun dries them. Perhaps you would telephone him? Tell him there has been further malicious damage, deliberate destruction this time." Miss Grey nodded numbly. Do you think it was Mr. Carver?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "I think," she said, "that someone wished your roses not to bloom. And last night they made sure of it. They returned to the house. Miss Grey went to telephone." Miss Marple remained in the garden, walking slowly along the path the intruder must have taken. She noted the broken twig on a low branch of lilac snapped off at waist height, as though someone had brushed past carelessly. She noted, too, a faint smear of mud on the gatepost, still damp, and a single leaf caught in the latch-ordinary laurel, but torn rather than fallen naturally. When Inspector Craddock arrived half an hour later, he found Miss Marple sitting quietly on the garden bench, knitting as though nothing untoward had occurred. He examined the ruined bush, the footprints, the button. "Careless," he observed, "or in too much of a hurry to notice. Or both," Miss Marple suggested. Craddock pocketed the button. "I'll have a word with Mr. Carver this morning. Discreetly, of course." "He may have an explanation." "He may," Miss Marple agreed. The inspector looked at her shrewdly. "You don't sound convinced." "I am convinced of very little at present," she replied. "But I am beginning to see a pattern. First the slow poisoning, gradual, secret. Then the planted bottle, obvious, meant to be found. Now this violent, reckless. It is as though the saboteur has changed his mind about how best to proceed, or grown desperate," Craddock said. "Desperation," Miss Marple echoed softly. "Yes, that is always interesting." She rose, folding her knitting. "If you will excuse me, Inspector, I have 1 or 2 small errands. But I should be grateful if you would let me know what Mr. Carver says." Craddock promised he would. Miss Marple walked home slowly, pausing once to speak to old Mrs. Bantry, who was leaning over her gate complaining of slugs. She listened politely, nodded at the right moments, but her thoughts were elsewhere. At Danemead Cottage, she removed her outdoor things, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the little escritoire in the sitting room. From a drawer, she took a small notebook, plain, leather-covered, the sort ladies once used for household accounts. In it she wrote, in her neat, old-fashioned hand, slow poisoning, copper or sulfur compounds, persistent but not immediately fatal to plants. Arsenic bottle, old but recently used, planted to mislead? Midnight visitor, male, footprints, cloaked, hasty. Brass button, mill wheel crest, Mr. Carver's property? Motive? She paused, then added one line more, not merely to win a prize, something more personal. She closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. Outside, the wind had dropped. The village lay quiet under a watery sun. But in Miss Marple's mind there was no quiet. She picked up her knitting again. The lavender bedsocks were nearly finished, but her eyes kept straying to the window, to the path that led past the mill house. Somewhere in Netherfold, she thought, someone had spent a sleepless night wondering whether the footprints had been seen, whether the button had been missed, and wondering, too, how much longer the secret could be kept. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Secrets, in her experience, had a way of growing heavier the longer they were carried, and sooner or later they dropped. Chapter 6. Motives and Memories. The afternoon following the midnight outrage at the Larches brought a deceptive calm to Netherfold. The sun came out fully at last, drying the puddles and coaxing a faint, hesitant warmth from the air. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of wasting the brightness on idle sitting. She had decided, after careful reflection, that the time had come to speak directly with the one person whose name kept recurring in her thoughts like an uninvited guest. Accordingly, she sent a small note by the hand of the village boy who ran errands for sixpence, a polite invitation to Mr. Edwin Carver to take tea at Danemead Cottage that very afternoon, if it is not inconvenient. The reply came back within the hour, handwritten on thick cream paper, courteous and prompt. Mr. Carver would be delighted. He arrived punctually at 4 o'clock, stepping through the garden gate in his familiar tweed jacket and carrying, rather unexpectedly, a small bunch of late-flowering sweet peas from his own plot. They were the old-fashioned kind, deep mauve and white, still fragrant despite the season. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly as he handed them over, "I thought these might cheer your room. They've done rather well this year, in spite of everything." Miss Marple accepted the flowers with a smile. "How kind. They are lovely. Do come in." She led him to the sitting room, where the tea-table was already laid. Thin bread and butter, seed cake, a pot of China tea, and a small dish of strawberry jam. Mr. Carver seated himself in the armchair opposite her own, accepted a cup, and looked about him with the air of a man who appreciates neatness and quiet. They spoke at first of trivial things, the weather, the late roses in the village, the forthcoming horticultural show. Mr. Carver quoted a line from Keats about beauty being truth, and Miss Marple nodded politely, though her mind was elsewhere. Presently she set down her cup. "You have heard, I suppose, of the further trouble at the Larches last night?" Mr. Carver's fingers tightened briefly on the handle of his cup. "I have. Dreadful business. Poor Miss Grey must be quite distraught." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "The prize rosebush Anna Harkness completely destroyed, uprooted and trampled. A most vindictive act." He looked down at his tea. "Vindictive, indeed. One can hardly credit it in a place like Netherfold." Miss Marple took up her knitting. The lavender bedsocks were finished. Now she had begun a pair in soft gray for the vicar's wife. "You are interested in rare plants, I believe, Mr. Carver?" He glanced up, surprised at the change of subject. "Yes. My book, such as it is, deals with hybridization. particularly among the old-fashioned roses. There are varieties one can still obtain if one knows where to look. Special treatment must be required for such delicate things. Indeed, soil acidity, drainage, the correct trace elements. One wrong move and the whole plant suffers. Miss Marple nodded. Copper sulfate, for instance, can be very useful in small quantities, though too much, of course, turns the soil sour and kills the roots. Mr. Carver's expression remained composed, but a faint flush appeared along his cheekbones. You are remarkably well informed on horticultural poisons, Miss Marple. I have lived a long time, she replied gently, and observed a good many gardens, and a good many gardeners. There was once a case not here, you understand, where a gentleman used copper compounds to ruin a rival's exhibit. Not out of malice, exactly. More out of fear. Fear? Mr. Carver echoed. Fear of losing something precious, or someone. There was a short silence. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Mr. Carver set his cup down with care. You are speaking in riddles, Miss Marple. Am I? I do apologize. I only meant that people sometimes do strange things when they believe a lady they admire is about to leave them. Move away, perhaps, to a larger garden in the south, with milder winters and better soil. Mr. Carver's face had grown pale. Miss Gray has spoken of such a thing? She has mentioned it to one or two friends, Miss Marple said tranquilly. Nothing definite, of course, but enough to make a sensitive person anxious. He looked away, towards the window, where the late sun slanted across the green. I have known Lavinia Miss Gray for some years. We shared an interest in roses. Nothing more. Yet you visited often when her garden flourished, Miss Marple observed. And then, not at all. Mr. Carver passed a hand across his forehead. There was a misunderstanding, a difference of opinion. I thought it best to keep away. Miss Marple clicked her needles once, twice. Misunderstandings can be painful, especially when one has hoped for more than friendship. He looked at her sharply. You think I think, Miss Marple said, that love, even quiet, unspoken love, can make people act in ways they would not otherwise consider. A little copper in the soil here, a little more there, enough to discourage growth without immediate suspicion. Then, when that failed to keep her rooted in Netherfold, something more drastic, a bottle planted to shift blame. And finally, in haste and anger, a midnight visit to destroy the one thing she valued most. Mr. Carver rose abruptly. This is monstrous. I have done nothing of the kind. Miss Marple looked up at him calmly. I did not say you had, Mr. Carver. I said people do strange things for love, or for fear of losing it. He stood for a moment, breathing quickly. If you will excuse me, I think I had better go. Miss Marple rose also. Of course. Thank you for coming, and for the sweet peas. He left without another word. The garden gate clicked behind him. Miss Marple returned to her chair, took up the gray wool, and resumed knitting. But her eyes were thoughtful. She had not accused him outright. There was no need. The seed was planted now, and in her experience, guilty minds watered such seeds themselves. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock called. He looked tired but alert. I've spoken to Carver, he said without preamble. He admits to owning a jacket with similar Button's family crest from his grandfather's time. One has been missing for weeks, he says. Claims he lost it in the garden some months ago. Miss Marple nodded. And the greenhouse? Full of copper-based fungicides. He uses them legitimately, he says, for black spot on his own roses. But the quantities are modest. Nothing excessive. Yet enough, perhaps, if applied persistently. Craddock rubbed his chin. He's nervous. I'll grant you that. But no confession. And no proof yet. Miss Marple considered. Proof will come, Inspector, when the right question is asked. Craddock looked at her curiously. You have a theory? I have several, she answered. But one is growing clearer. It is not about the silver cup at all. It never was. It is about a lady who wished to leave Netherfold, and a gentleman who could not bear to let her go. Craddock gave a low whistle. Personal, then. Very personal. Always the most dangerous kind, Miss Marple said softly. She glanced at the bunch of sweet peas in the vase on the table. Their scent was sweet, almost cloying. Human nature, she added, is the strongest poison of all, and sometimes the hardest to detect until the roots begin to wither. Outside, dusk was falling over Netherfold. The village lights came on one by one. And somewhere in the old mill house, Miss Marple thought, a man was sitting alone, staring at an empty buttonhole, and wondering how much longer he could keep his secret. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The day of the Netherfold Horticultural Show dawned bright and unusually warm for late June, with a sky of unbroken blue and a light breeze that set the bunting fluttering above the village hall. Inside, trestle tables groaned under the weight of exhibits, gleaning marrows, pyramids of tomatoes, vases of sweet peas, bowls of strawberries. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and the murmur of judging committees. At the center of the main hall stood the display table reserved for roses. Miss Gray's entry occupied only a small space now, a single modest vase containing 3 surviving blooms of Mrs. Sam McGreedy, salvaged from an overlooked corner bed. Beside it, Mrs. Lorimer's dahlias blazed in triumphant profusion, their colors almost defiant. The silver cup gleamed on its velvet cushion, waiting. Miss Marple arrived early, in her best gray silk and the hat with the velvet pansies. She carried her knitting bag, though the needles remained idle. She moved quietly among the exhibits, nodding to acquaintances, listening more than she spoke. Inspector Craddock found her near the rose table. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice. "A word, if you please." They stepped aside to a quiet corner near the tea urn. "I've had men at the mill house since dawn," he told her. "Carver wasn't there, gone out walking, his housekeeper said. But we examined the greenhouse. Found several packets of copper sulfate, some opened and partially used. Also a small stock of arsenical weed killer, though none matched the bottle from the larches exactly. And," he lowered his voice further, "a tweed jacket hanging in the hall. One button missing from the cuff. The crest matches." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the soil samples?" "Preliminary results from the laboratory confirm copper poisoning throughout Miss Gray's garden. Gradual, repeated applications. Enough to weaken, but not immediately kill. The arsenic bottle appears to have been a later addition scarcely. Any residue in the soil near where it was buried. A clumsy afterthought," Miss Marple murmured. "Precisely. Carver's fingerprints were on the bottle, clear ones, not wiped." Miss Marple's gaze traveled across the hall to where Miss Gray stood, pale but composed, beside her diminished exhibit. "Has he been found?" "Not yet. But we've men watching the station and the main roads. He can't have gone far." At that moment the doors opened wider. Villagers streamed in, and with them came Mr. Edwin Carver. He looked composed, almost serene, dressed in his usual tweed, though the cuff where the missing button had been was now pinned with an ordinary safety pin. He carried a small notebook, as though he had come merely to observe. He made his way directly to the rose table, paused before Miss Gray's vase, and bowed slightly. "Lavinia," he said quietly, "I am so very sorry." Miss Gray turned. Her face showed no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. "Edwin," Inspector Craddock moved forward, but Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "Wait," she said. Mr. Carver looked round at the gathering crowd. Mrs. Prestwich, Major Hargreaves, Mrs. Lorimer with her dahlias, Dr. Fenwick, old Gurney in his best suit. Then his eyes returned to Miss Gray. "I never meant harm," he began, his voice low but carrying in the sudden hush. "Only to keep you here a little longer. You spoke so often of moving south of a new garden, a fresh start. I thought, if the roses failed, you might stay. Rely on my advice, perhaps. On me." A murmur ran through the hall. Miss Gray's lips trembled. You poisoned my garden. My roses, everything I loved. Not poison, he said quickly. A check. A temporary check. Copper sulfate in small doses enough to sour the soil, to make the plants struggle. I told myself it was scientific experiment. But when you still talked of leaving, when the show drew near and your entries were still perfect, I panicked. The bottle, I placed it there to suggest accident, or perhaps someone else's malice. I thought the police would conclude carelessness on your part. And last night? Craddock asked sharply. Carver's shoulders sagged. Last night I lost my head. I saw the silver cup within reach again, your chance to win despite everything. I could not bear it. I went to destroy the last hope. I did not think how it would look. Miss Gray turned away, tears in her eyes. Miss Marple stepped forward. There is one thing more, Mr. Carver, she said gently. You loved Miss Gray. That much is clear. But love that seeks to confine is not love. It is possession. And possession can be as deadly as any poison. Carver looked at her, then at the ruined vase. I know that now, he said simply. Inspector Craddock placed a hand on his arm. Mr. Carver, I must ask you to come with me. Carver made no resistance. As they passed through the crowd, he paused once more before Miss Gray. Forgive me if you can, he whispered. I never meant to hurt you, only to keep you near. Miss Gray did not answer. The doors closed behind them. A buzz of talk broke out, but it was subdued, almost respectful. Miss Marple turned to Miss Gray. My dear, she said, the soil can be treated. Lime, fresh compost, time. Your garden will bloom again. Miss Gray managed a small, tremulous smile. Perhaps, but not the same. No, Miss Marple agreed. Not quite the same. But gardens, like people, recover from many things. Mrs. Prestwich came up, offering tea. The judging continued. The silver cup went, inevitably, to Mrs. Lorimer's dahlias. She accepted it with modest pleasure, though her eyes kept straying to the empty space where Miss Gray's roses should have stood. By evening, the hall emptied. Miss Marple walked home in the golden light, the horticultural show over for another year. She thought of Mr. Carver, now in custody, facing charges of malicious damage, attempted fraud, perhaps even a charge of poisoning if the evidence warranted. No one had died. No one had been physically harmed. Yet the wound to Miss Gray's heart and pride would take longer to heal than any rosebed. At Danemead Cottage, she sat in her accustomed chair, took up fresh wool soft pink this time, and began another pair of bedsocks. Outside, the village settled into twilight, and somewhere in the quiet rooms of the Larches, Miss Gray would be looking out at her stricken garden, wondering whether anything could ever grow there again. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Things would grow. They always did, given time and care, even in the most poisoned soil. Chapter 8. The Bloom Returns. The weeks that followed the horticultural show passed quietly in Netherfold, as though the village itself had drawn a long, relieved breath. Mr. Edwin Carver was dealt with discreetly. The charge settled upon malicious damage to property and attempted fraud, with no insistence on the graver accusation of poisoning. The magistrates took into account his previous good character, his evident remorse, and the fact that no permanent physical harm had been done to any person. He received a suspended sentence and was ordered to make restitution for the cost of soil treatment and new plants at the Larches. After that, he left the old mill house quietly one morning before most of the village was awake, bound for a small university town in the north, where he hoped to continue his botanical studies in greater obscurity. The whispers died down almost as quickly as they had risen. Netherfold had its share of small dramas every year: lost cats, disputed fences, a scandalous elopement once in a blue moon, but this one had touched too closely on the universal human fear of being confined by another's affection. People preferred not to dwell on it. At the Larches, the work of restoration began almost at once. Old Gurney, grumbling but loyal, supervised the removal of the worst affected topsoil. Barrows of fresh loam arrived from the nursery in Market Drayton. Bags of lime were spread with careful hand. New compost, well-rotted and sweet-smelling, was worked in. Miss Gray herself took part, though at first her movements were slow and her face still shadowed. She wore an old sun hat and gardening gloves, and spoke little. Miss Marple called twice a week, bringing small pots of rooted cuttings from her own garden geraniums, pinks, a few hardy violas. She never mentioned Mr. Carver unless Miss Gray did so first, and then only in the gentlest terms. One bright morning in mid-July, Miss Marple found her friend kneeling beside the principal rosebed, pressing fresh soil round the base of a newly planted standard. The canes were still short, the leaves small, but they were green, vivid, healthy green. "They're taking," Miss Gray said, without looking up. "All of them, even the Ina Harkness replacement." "I thought it would never root." Miss Marple bent beside her. "Roses are resilient creatures," she observed. "Given the right conditions, they forget their troubles remarkably quickly." Miss Gray brushed earth from her hands. "I shall never forget. Not entirely. But I think I can live with the memory now." Miss Marple nodded. "Memory is a garden, too. One learns which weeds to pull and which flowers to cherish." They worked in companionable silence for a while. The sun warmed their backs. A blackbird sang from the lime trees. Bees hummed among the lavender that had begun to recover along the border. Presently, Miss Gray spoke again. "Elspeth tells me the new people at the mill house are pleasant. A young couple with 2 small children. They've already started clearing the old greenhouse." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A new beginning." "How satisfactory." Miss Gray straightened, looking round the garden. "I shan't win any more silver cups," she said. "Not next year, at any rate. But I don't mind. There are other prizes." "Indeed there are," Miss Marple agreed. "The pleasure of seeing one's own flowers bloom is not the least of them." They rose and walked slowly back to the house. On the porch, Miss Gray paused. "Jane, thank you for seeing what no one else did, for not letting it become something uglier than it already was." Miss Marple patted her arm. "One does what one can, my dear, and sometimes that is enough." She took her leave and walked home along the familiar footpath. The village green was lively with children playing cricket. Major Hargreaves sat on his bench reading the newspaper. Mrs. Sims waved from the post office door. Everything was as it should be. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple removed her hat, hung it on the stand, and went into the sitting room. The bunch of sweet peas Mr. Carver had brought weeks earlier had long since faded and been replaced by roses from her own border, Gertrude Jekyll, deep, pink, and richly scented. She sat in her chair by the window, took up her knitting a new pair, cream wool with a simple cable pattern, and began. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the garden, touching her own roses with gold. They bloomed in profusion: crimson, shell pink, ivory, apricot. Not a single leaf showed blight. Not a stem drooped. Miss Marple glanced at them with quiet satisfaction. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, "is indeed the most reliable poison of all. And the best antidote, too, when one knows where to look." She smiled a little, remembering the many small signs she had noted: the button, the stain, the footprints, the missing visits, the desperate act in the dark. And she remembered, too, how one quiet conversation in a sunlit sitting room had been enough to bring the truth into the open, without scandal or public humiliation beyond what was necessary. The needles clicked steadily. Somewhere in the north, Mr. Carver would be starting afresh, perhaps wiser, perhaps sadder. At the Larches, Miss Gray would watch new buds swell and open. In Netherfold, life would go on ordinary, small, and surprisingly kind. Miss Marple turned the page of her pattern book, and the garden that wouldn't grow had, after all, begun to grow again. Very nicely, too.